Ethan had always imagined that moving to Maplewood would bring him peace. But peace didn't come easily when your heart carried too many memories. At 27, he had already been through enough to make him feel twice his age, a failed engagement, a career that didn't go as planned, and a loneliness that followed him like a quiet shadow. His new house sat at the end of a calm, tree-lined street where neighbors smiled politely but rarely stopped to talk. It was the kind of place where the world slowed down, and yet, inside Ethan's chest, everything still raced. Across the street lived the Carters. David and Julia, a couple in their mid-50s who seemed to have life all figured out. They had a small but beautiful garden that caught the sunlight every morning, and their laughter carried across the street like a soft melody. Julia often wore pastel colors, her light brown hair tied neatly, and she always had a warm, welcoming smile. David, tall with a calm presence, was often seen fixing things around the house or washing his old blue car. They looked like the kind of couple who had spent years growing together rather than apart. For the first 2 weeks, Ethan only exchanged polite hellos. He watched them sometimes from his porch, admiring the way they seemed at peace with each other, something he hadn't felt in years. One Sunday afternoon, while Ethan was unpacking a few boxes in his living room, he heard someone calling from outside. "Ethan." It was Julia, standing by her gate, waving at him with that same easy smile. "You've been here for weeks, and we still haven't had a proper introduction. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight?" Ethan froze for a moment. He wasn't used to social invitations anymore. Since his breakup, he had avoided people, especially couples. They reminded him of what he'd lost. But there was something about Julia's warmth that disarmed him. She didn't ask with pity. She asked like a neighbor who truly wanted to know him. "I'd like that," Ethan said finally, and for the first time in months, he meant it. That evening, the air felt lighter. As he crossed the street with a small bottle of wine in hand, Ethan felt strangely nervous. Not because it was dinner, because it had been so long since anyone had made him feel welcome. Julia greeted him at the door with the smell of roasted herbs and soft music drifting through the house. "Come in," she said, leading him to a cozy dining room filled with warm light. David was setting the table and smiled when he saw him. "Glad you could make it, son." Julia's been talking about how quiet the street feels without a young face around. The dinner table looked simple but perfect, a homemade meal, candles flickering gently, and the kind of atmosphere that made you want to stay longer than planned. They talked easily. Julia asked about his work. Ethan told them about his writing, how he used to work as a copywriter, but was now trying to finish his first novel. David shared stories about his years managing a construction company and how retirement had given him time to rediscover old hobbies. The conversation flowed naturally, without effort, and every moment felt sincere. Julia had a way of listening that made Ethan feel understood. She asked thoughtful questions, not just polite ones. When he spoke about his failed engagement, she didn't offer advice or sympathy, just quiet understanding. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the things that break us are the same things that make room for something better." Ethan didn't know why, but those words stayed with him long after dinner ended. They moved to the porch after dessert, where the night air felt cool and easy. Fireflies blinked in the garden, and David poured them each a cup of coffee. The three of them sat there talking about everything from books to the little quirks of small-town life. Julia mentioned how she used to paint before life got busy. "I always thought I'd go back to it," she said, smiling wistfully. "But then somehow the years just passed." Ethan noticed the way her eyes softened when she said that. There was something deeply human in her tone, the kind of quiet regret that comes not from mistakes, but from time slipping by unnoticed. He felt a strange sense of connection, not romantic, but profoundly human. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about what went wrong in his life. He was simply there, sharing a moment with people who made him feel seen, as the night grew darker. Julia stood and said, "You're welcome here anytime. Ethan, you don't have to wait for another invitation." David nodded in agreement, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. "You're part of the neighborhood now. Don't stay cooped up all day. Life's too short for that." Ethan smiled genuinely. "Thank you. This really means a lot." "'Kay?" When he returned home that night, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. His house, once filled with echoes of his past, now felt like a place where something new could begin. He sat by the window, looking out at the Carters' porch. The lights were still on, and he could faintly hear their laughter again. It was the kind of sound that reminded him life still had warmth to offer, even when you least expected it. That night, he opened his laptop for the first time in weeks. His unfinished manuscript stared back at him, half-written sentences and broken ideas. But this time, words began to flow again. Not about heartbreak, but about connection. About how a simple act of kindness could awaken something in a lonely soul. Ethan didn't realize it yet. But that dinner was the quiet start of a story that would reshape his heart. Julia and David weren't just kind neighbors, they were a mirror reflecting the parts of him he thought were gone. As he typed, he remembered Julia's words again. "The things that break us make room for something better." Maybe she was right. Maybe new beginnings didn't always come from big events. Sometimes they started with a smile, a conversation, or a home-cooked meal. Before going to bed, Ethan stepped out onto his porch. The night was calm, the moon soft over Maplewood. He could still see the glow of the Carters' porch light across the street. It flickered gently, steady and warm, like a small promise that he wasn't alone anymore. And as he stood there, feeling the quiet peace of that moment, Ethan didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to find out. And it all began with one unexpected dinner invitation. After that dinner, things began to change for Ethan in small, almost invisible ways. His mornings didn't feel as heavy, and evenings didn't seem so long. He started noticing things around him again, the way sunlight hit the leaves, the laughter of children riding their bikes, the quiet peace that came from simply being part of life again. Julia and David had unknowingly brought him back to the world, and their kindness had left a mark deeper than he expected. Every few days, Julia would wave at him from across the street, holding her coffee mug, that same easy smile on her face. Sometimes she'd shout, "Go for a walk with me later," and he'd nod without hesitation. What began as short strolls around the block soon turned into longer walks through Maplewood's tree-lined streets. They talked about everything: books, art, music, the strange turns life takes, and the quiet lessons that come from growing older. Julia wasn't like most people Ethan knew. She didn't rush to fill silences. She had a calm way of speaking, her words thoughtful and sincere. She didn't ask questions to pry. She asked because she genuinely cared. And she listened, really listened. Something rare in Ethan's world. Sometimes David joined them, walking beside them with that patient, steady presence. He would tell funny stories from his younger days, and Julia would roll her eyes, laughing softly. Ethan loved seeing them together. They had that effortless connection, the kind that comes from years of choosing each other every single day. It was something beautiful, something he hadn't believed in anymore. But as weeks passed, Ethan started noticing small changes. David's steps grew slower. His voice sometimes faded mid-sentence, and he would stop to rest more often. Julia never said much about it, just kept a gentle hand on his arm, helping him steady himself. Ethan didn't ask it, didn't feel like his place, but a quiet concern grew inside him. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the rooftops, it was just Julia and Ethan walking. The air was cool, and fallen leaves crunched under their shoes. They spoke softly, and after a long pause, Julia said, "You know, people spend too much time thinking about how old they are instead of how alive they feel." Ethan smiled, thinking about her words. "I guess that's true," he said. "Most people my age are already afraid of time passing." She nodded. "Time doesn't take everything from us, Ethan. Sometimes it gives us a clearer view of what matters." He didn't say anything after that, but her words stayed with him. Julia had a way of saying simple things that carried deep meaning. She wasn't trying to be wise, she just spoke from experience, from living. And something about that stirred something in him. He found himself writing again at night, inspired by their talks. His stories became softer, more human. He wrote about connection, hope, and the little ways people change each other's lives without even realizing it. Julia had become his muse, not in a romantic sense, but as a light that reminded him what it meant to feel again. A few days later, Julia stopped by his porch. She was carrying a basket of freshly baked muffins. "I made too many," she said, smiling. "You'll be doing me a favor if you take some." Ethan laughed. "You're finding creative ways to make sure I don't skip dinner again?" "Maybe," she said teasingly. "Or maybe I just like feeding people who appreciate homemade food." That small exchange felt natural, comfortable. Julia had become someone Ethan could talk to about anything. His writing struggles, his doubts, even his loneliness. She never judged him, never tried to fix him, only reminded him that healing took time. As autumn deepened, their walks continued. The world turned golden, and Maplewood felt like a painting leaf swirling, the air crisp and quiet. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just walked side by side, listening to the rustling of trees. It was peaceful. It's like two souls finding comfort in each other's presence without needing to explain why. But one evening, Ethan noticed something different. Julia's smile seemed a little tired, her eyes softer, almost distant. When he asked if everything was okay, she simply said, "Just one of those days," and changed the subject. He didn't push, though worry tugged at him quietly. Over the next few weeks, David joined their walks less and less. Julia began walking alone or with Ethan, always keeping the conversations light. But Ethan could sense something was wrong. One evening, she mentioned David had been under the weather, but her tone carried more than those words said. Ethan didn't know what to say, so he offered what little comfort he could, just being there. One chilly evening, Julia invited Ethan for tea. They sat in her kitchen, the warm light casting soft shadows on the walls. She asked him to read a piece of his writing, and he reluctantly agreed. His voice trembled slightly as he read about a man rediscovering hope after losing everything. When he finished, Julia's eyes glistened. "You write like someone who's lived 100 lives," she said quietly. Ethan smiled. "Maybe I've just felt too much for one lifetime." "Then you'll make a great writer," she said softly. "Feeling deeply is both a gift and a burden, but it's how we connect." That night, after he left, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about her words. Julia wasn't just kind. She was real, someone who carried both strength and softness in perfect balance. There was something magnetic about her, not in appearance, but in spirit. She made him see the beauty in things he used to overlook. But there was also something fragile about her lately. The way she sometimes drifted into thought. The quiet sighs when she thought no one noticed, it all hinted at something unspoken. Ethan didn't know what it was, but he sensed it was heavy. One night, they reached the end of their walk. Julia stopped near the park bench where they usually sat. The streetlights glowed softly against the misty evening air. "Ethan," she said gently, "promise me something." "What's that?" he asked. "Promise me you'll keep writing no matter what happens. Even if you think no one's reading, keep writing. The world needs stories that make people feel." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight in her voice. "I promise," he said. She smiled, a sad but sincere smile. "Good. That's all I needed to hear." When he got home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something he couldn't quite name. Julia's words, her tone, her sudden seriousness, it all lingered in his mind. He didn't know it yet, but that promise would soon mean more than he could imagine. And as he sat by the window, watching the Carter's house across the street, he felt a quiet ache in his chest, a sense that their story was just beginning to unfold in ways he never expected. A week after their last walk, Ethan received a message from Julia. Her voice over the phone sounded softer than usual, almost trembling. "Would you mind coming over for coffee?" she asked. He said yes right away, sensing something wasn't right. When he arrived, the house felt different, quieter, dimmer. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. But the warmth that usually lived in that home seemed dimmed by something heavier. Julia looked tired. Her hair was tied loosely, and her eyes carried a weight that words couldn't hide. She smiled gently, trying to keep things normal. "David isn't well," she finally said. He's been in and out of the hospital." Her tone was calm, but her hands shook slightly as she poured the coffee. Ethan didn't know what to say. He had always seen David as strong, steady, full of life. It didn't feel real that something could be wrong with him. "I'm sorry, Julia," he said quietly. "Is there anything I can do?" She gave him a grateful smile. "You being here is enough." That became a pattern. Ethan started helping out whenever he could, mowing their lawn, bringing groceries, sometimes just keeping her company when David was resting. They never talked about the illness directly. Julia spoke of small things instead: the garden, the weather, her old paintings. But Ethan noticed the fatigue in her eyes growing each day, the faint sadness that lingered behind her gentle smile. One afternoon, as he was trimming the hedges, Julia came outside with 2 glasses of lemonade. They sat together on the porch steps, the sun falling softly behind them. "You remind me of David when he was your age," she said, looking at him fondly. "He had that same kind heart, always trying to help everyone." Ethan smiled. "You two seem like you've been through everything together." She nodded slowly. "We have. We met in college. We built this house, raised 2 children, and somehow found time to laugh through it all." She paused. "You think life will always stay that way, but time, it changes everything." Her voice cracked slightly at the last word, and for a brief moment Ethan saw the pain she tried so hard to hide. He wanted to say something comforting, but all he could offer was quiet understanding. As days turned into weeks, David's health worsened. Ethan noticed the empty spaces, the missing laughter, the quiet house, the dimmed lights. Julia stayed strong on the outside, greeting neighbors, smiling politely, but Ethan could see through it. She was holding herself together for everyone else. One evening, she called Ethan over again. The house was filled with soft music and the smell of soup. "He's sleeping," she said, her voice low. "He had a rough day." They sat at the kitchen table, not talking much, just sharing silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that said more than words ever could. After a while, she looked at him with tired eyes. "You know," she said, "sometimes I forget what it's like to just breathe without worrying. I wake up and wonder what the next day will bring. And yet I still find myself grateful for the mornings, for the people who show up, for the moments that make life feel real again." Ethan nodded. "You've handled all of this with more strength than anyone I've ever met." She gave a faint smile. "Strength isn't always what it looks like. Sometimes it's just putting one foot in front of the other, pretending you're fine until you are." Her honesty struck him deeply. He realized how much he admired her, not in a way that demanded anything, but in a way that felt like respect and quiet affection. She had become someone who inspired him, someone who reminded him that kindness could exist even in the middle of pain. One day, as they walked through the garden, Julia stopped near the rose bushes David had planted years ago. "He loves these," she said softly. "Every spring he'd make sure they bloomed perfectly." She reached down and touched a single red rose. "He told me once that every bloom was a promise, that even after the hardest winters, something beautiful can grow again." Ethan stood beside her, unsure what to say. The way she spoke about David wasn't just love, it was devotion. It was years of memories stitched together by patience and forgiveness. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for both of them. That evening, after helping her carry a few boxes from the attic, Ethan sat on the porch with her again. The air was quiet and the streetlights flickered gently. Julia leaned back in her chair and whispered, "You remind me that life still has softness in it." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "Me?" She nodded. "You bring light without even trying. That's rare, Ethan. Don't lose that part of yourself." He didn't know how to respond. For the first time, he realized that their bond had grown into something deeply emotional, not romantic in the traditional sense, but meaningful in a way that touched both of them. Julia was more than a neighbor. She had become a piece of his story, someone who helped him heal without even knowing it. In the following weeks, Julia became quieter. She stopped joining community gatherings, and sometimes Ethan would see her sitting alone by the window, lost in thought. He visited more often just to make sure she wasn't alone. They shared coffee, short conversations. and long silences filled with mutual understanding. Then, one rainy afternoon, Julia opened up in a way she never had before. "He's getting weaker," she said, her voice shaking. "The doctors say we don't have much time left." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm so sorry." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You don't have to say that. I've had a good life with him. I'm not ready to say goodbye." Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hold back. When you love someone that long, you forget how to imagine life without them. Ethan reached out, resting his hand gently over hers. It wasn't a gesture of romance, but one of quiet empathy. "You're not alone, Julia," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes glistening, and nodded. "Thank you, Ethan. You've been a blessing in a very hard time." That night, after he returned home, Ethan couldn't sleep. He thought about Julia's words, about love and loss, and how fragile everything could be. He realized how much he cared for her, not because he wanted something from her, but because she had shown him a kind of strength and warmth he'd forgotten existed. Over the next few days, he continued visiting, helping where he could. David's condition worsened, and the sound of monitors and quiet footsteps filled the Carters' home. Ethan didn't intrude, he simply made himself available, steady presence when needed. One evening, Julia walked him to the door. "You've done so much for us," she said softly. "I hope you know how much that means." Ethan smiled faintly. "You don't have to thank me. You and David have done more for me than you realize." She tilted her head, curious. "How so?" "Before I met you," he said, "I'd forgotten what real connection felt like. You both reminded me." Julia's eyes softened and she whispered, "Then maybe that's what we were meant to do for each other." As he stepped out into the cool night air, Ethan glanced back at the house. The lights were dim, the porch quiet. Something inside him knew that life was about to change for Julia, for him, and for the story they had unknowingly begun to share. And as rain began to fall gently on the street, he whispered to himself, "Sometimes love doesn't ask to stay. It just asks to be remembered." Winter came quietly to Maplewood. The trees stood bare, and the streets that once echoed with laughter now carried a stillness that seemed to match the silence in Julia's house. Ethan hadn't seen her much in the past few weeks. David's health had worsened, and every time Ethan looked across the street, he saw only dim lights and drawn curtains. The once lively porch now sat empty, its rocking chair unmoved. Then, one gray morning, Ethan saw an ambulance parked outside. His heart dropped. He didn't need anyone to tell him what had happened. Later that evening, Julia called. Her voice was steady but hollow. "David passed peacefully this morning," she said softly. "He wasn't in pain. He was just tired." Ethan stood in silence, unsure what to say. "I'm so sorry, Julia," he whispered finally. "Thank you," she replied gently. "He'd be glad you were part of his last year. You brought him joy, Ethan, more than you know." After the call ended, Ethan sat by his window, looking out at the Carters' house. Snow began to fall, slow and quiet, blanketing the street in white. He couldn't stop thinking about how much love and history that home carried, and how different it would feel without David's laughter in it. The funeral came a few days later. It was small, intimate, and filled with warmth. Julia stood by the altar, calm and graceful, speaking about her husband not with sorrow but with deep gratitude. "He gave me a lifetime of ordinary days that felt extraordinary," she said. Her words struck Ethan's heart like a quiet truth. Love wasn't always grand gestures or perfect stories. Sometimes it was the gentle presence of someone who stayed. After the service, Ethan walked up to her. She looked fragile yet strong, her eyes carrying both pain and peace. "You were there when I needed a friend," she said softly. "Don't disappear now." "I won't," Ethan promised. And he meant it. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued visiting her, though less often. Julia spent most of her time tending the garden again, even in the cold. It was her way of coping, pruning, watering, cleaning, finding life where it still existed. Sometimes they sat together without speaking, sipping tea as snowflakes fell outside. Their friendship had deepened into something quiet but meaningful. Then one afternoon, a few months later, Ethan found a small white envelope in his mailbox. His name was written on it in Julia's delicate handwriting. Inside was a folded letter. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I've finally taken the step I've been putting off. I've decided to move closer to my daughter in Vermont. This house, this street, they've held so many memories, but it's time for me to start a new chapter. Before I go, I need to thank you. You came into our lives when the light was beginning to fade, and somehow you helped it shine again. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that people still listen, and that even when life feels heavy, there's always warmth left to be found. David loved you too, you know? He told me one night, that boy reminds me of hope. He saw in you what I did, a heart that still believes, even after it's been broken. Keep writing, Ethan. Keep feeling, keep trying, keep living. And remember, love doesn't end. It just changes shape. With affection, Julia. Ethan read the letter 3 times. Each word carried her voice, calm and sincere, and it made his eyes sting. He hadn't realized how much her presence had shaped him, how her wisdom and quiet strength had pulled him out of his own emptiness. She had taught him more about life, love, and loss than anyone else ever had. A few days later, Julia came by to say goodbye in person. She looked lighter somehow, at peace. "You'll be fine," she said, smiling softly. "You've got a good heart. Don't hide it." Ethan helped her load the last few boxes into the car. As she closed the door, she looked at him one last time. "Right? Something beautiful, Ethan," she said. "Something that reminds people that love is still worth believing in." He nodded, unable to speak. She gave him a gentle hug, warm, steady, filled with years of meaning, and then she was gone. The car disappeared down the quiet Maplewood street, leaving behind an echo of memories and a porch light that would never shine quite the same again. For weeks, Ethan felt her absence deeply. The neighborhood seemed emptier. But with time, he began to understand that her leaving wasn't an ending. It was another lesson. She had shown him how to live with grace, how to hold on and let go at the same time. One spring morning, months after she'd left, Ethan finished writing his book, the one she had encouraged him to complete. It wasn't a story about love in the traditional sense. It was a story about connection, about how people can walk into your life for a short while and still change everything. When the book was published, Ethan dedicated it simply, "For Julia, who taught me that love is timeless, and that kindness is never wasted." The book slowly found its readers. People wrote letters sharing how it made them remember someone they once loved or lost. Ethan realized then that Julia's words had gone beyond her. They had become part of something larger. One evening, he sat on his porch just like old times. The garden across the street had grown wild, yet in the middle of it, he saw something bright. The rose bushes David had planted years ago were in full bloom, red and vibrant against the fading light. It made Ethan smile. It felt like a message, one last sign of life, of beauty that endures even after everything changes. He whispered softly, "You were right, Julia. Something beautiful can always grow again." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan closed his eyes and let the moment sink in. He wasn't lonely anymore. The love and wisdom she'd shared still lived in him, guiding him forward. She had surprised him, not with romance, but with something far greater, a deeper understanding of love, one that had no age, no end, and no boundaries. That night, as he sat at his desk to write again, he began his next story with the words, "She wasn't part of my plan, but she changed everything." He smiled to himself, feeling her presence like a quiet echo in the room. Life had moved on, but her influence remained, gentle, eternal. Ethan looked out the window one last time. The stars faint but steady over Maplewood. He realized then that Julia hadn't really left. She had simply become a part of the story he was meant to tell. And as he began to type, he knew with certainty the people who touch our hearts never truly fade away. They live on in words, in memories, and in the love they leave behind. And that was Julia's final gift, the reminder that love in any form never truly ends.